The moving truck pulled up to the elegant two-story house on Oak Lane just as the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of Riverside Heights. The new homeowner, a tall man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a confident stride, stood in his driveway, directing the movers with a calm authority that came from years of leadership experience. What his new neighbors didn't know was that behind his friendly smile and casual weekend attire of jeans and a dark blue polo shirt, he was one of the FBI's most respected agents. For 15 years, he dedicated his career to investigating civil rights violations, earning commendations for solving several high-profile cases that had changed lives and communities across the country. The decision to move to this upscale Virginia suburb hadn't been a difficult one. The neighborhood's proximity to the FBI Academy in Quantico, where he frequently taught courses on investigating hate crimes, made it an ideal location. Plus, after years of living in the heart of the city, he was ready for the peace and quiet that Riverside Heights promised. As he helped the movers navigate his grandmother's antique dining table through the front door, he noticed several curious faces peeking out from behind curtains in the surrounding houses. It was natural, he thought, for people to be interested in a new neighbor. In his line of work, he'd learned to read people and situations quickly, and he could already sense the mix of curiosity and something else, an underlying tension he couldn't quite place. Throughout the morning, a steady stream of dog walkers and joggers passed by his house, each taking longer looks than necessary at the moving activity. A few waved politely, while others quickly averted their eyes when he looked in their direction. He returned each acknowledgement with a friendly nod, already making mental notes about the community dynamics. An old habit from his years of investigative work. By early afternoon, he'd set up his home office, a modest room overlooking the backyard where a large oak tree provided perfect shade. The walls were lined with law books and framed certificates, but he deliberately placed these out of view from the windows. In his experience, maintaining a low profile often revealed more about his surroundings than making his credentials known. The kitchen still needed organizing, but he took a break to sit on his new front porch, sipping coffee and watching the neighborhood's weekend routine unfold. Children rode their bikes down the street, couples walked hand in hand, and the sound of lawnmowers created a suburban symphony. It all seemed picture-perfect, almost too perfect. A silver-haired woman walking her poodle crossed to the other side of the street as she approached his house, tugging her dog along despite its interest in greeting the new resident. Minutes later, a young couple pushing a stroller did the same, their casual conversation dropping to whispers as they passed. To most people, these might have seemed like coincidences, but 15 years of FBI training had taught him to notice patterns in human behavior. As the sun began to set, he unpacked the last box in his living room. Inside, he found a framed photo of his FBI Academy graduation class, a diverse group of determined faces ready to serve and protect. He placed it on his desk, facing away from the window, a reminder of his purpose and the importance of his work, but also of the need for discretion in his new role as both observer and neighbor. The day ended with him sitting on his back porch, listening to the cicadas and planning his next few weeks. He'd need to establish his routine, get to know the community, and most importantly, understand its underlying currents. Tomorrow would bring his first full day as a resident of Riverside Heights, and with it, the beginning of what he suspected would be an interesting chapter in his life. Little did his neighbors know that their new resident wasn't just another homeowner looking for a quiet suburban life. He was someone who had dedicated his career to uncovering the truth beneath peaceful facades and bringing justice to those who needed it most. But for now, he was content to watch, listen, and settle into his new home, knowing that time would reveal whatever secrets this seemingly perfect neighborhood might hold. The neighborhood block party was in full swing on Cherry Blossom Lane, with tables of potluck dishes stretching down the street and children darting between clusters of chatting adults. The new FBI agent stood near a table of desserts, holding a paper plate with untouched potato salad as he observed the social dynamics unfolding around him. He'd received the invitation 3 days ago, tucked into his mailbox without an envelope, just a bright yellow flyer advertising the annual summer gathering. The couple from across the street had watched from their porch as he retrieved it, their expressions unreadable from a distance. Now, that same couple commanded attention at the center of the party. The husband, wearing an expensive polo shirt and designer sunglasses, kept glancing in the agent's direction while speaking in hushed tones to small groups of neighbors. His wife, dressed in high-end casual wear that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills, would occasionally touch people's arms as she spoke, lending emphasis to whatever she was saying. The agent noticed how the crowd subtly shifted throughout the afternoon. Whenever he approached a group, conversations would either halt abruptly or continue with forced cheerfulness. Parents would suddenly remember they needed to check on their children. Elderly neighbors would discover their drinks needed refilling. It was the kind of orchestrated social distancing that spoke volumes about the whispers circulating through the community. "I just don't understand why the property values in this neighborhood have started dropping," the wife's voice carried across the gathering, just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. "It used to be such a nice area." Her husband nodded in agreement, making sure to look directly at their new neighbor as he spoke to another resident. The agent took a slow sip of his lemonade, watching as several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. A young mother glanced his way with an apologetic look before hurrying her children toward the bounce house. He'd seen this dance before, the careful choreography of prejudice, where some lead and others follow, either through agreement or fearful silence. As the afternoon wore on, the couple's comments became less subtle. "You know, I've noticed more cars driving slowly through the neighborhood lately," the husband announced to anyone within earshot. "We might need to increase security patrols." His wife nodded vigorously, adding, "Better safe than sorry. You never know who might be moving in these days." The agent noticed a few neighbors beginning to distance themselves from the couple, though not openly challenging their behavior. An older gentleman with kind eyes caught his gaze and gave a slight headshake, seemingly embarrassed by the situation. A young couple with a baby stroller made their excuses and left early, the wife looking troubled as they passed by. Throughout it all, the agent maintained his composure, mentally documenting each interaction, each pointed comment, each subtle slight. His years of training had taught him the importance of patience, of letting situations develop naturally while gathering evidence. He learned that people who harbor prejudice often become bolder when they feel their actions go unchallenged. As the sun began to set and neighbors started packing up their lawn chairs and collecting their potluck dishes, the couple made one final circuit through the remaining guests. Their voices carried just enough for the agent to hear. "We really need to discuss property standards at the next HOA meeting. Some people clearly don't understand the level of community we're trying to maintain here." The agent carefully packed up his untouched contribution to the potluck, exchanged polite goodbyes with those nearby, and walked back to his house. Behind him, he could hear the couple's continued commentary, now even less restrained as they assumed he was out of earshot. Inside his home, he sat at his desk and began typing detailed notes about the day's events. Names, times, specific quotes, and observations about who had been present for each interaction. It was a habit ingrained from years of investigative work, though this time the notes held a more personal significance. As night fell over the neighborhood, he could see the couple across the street through their brightly lit windows, gesturing animatedly as they spoke to someone on the phone. He knew from experience that this was just the beginning. People who felt entitled to express their prejudices openly rarely stopped at words alone. What the couple didn't realize was that their new neighbor had spent his career studying exactly this kind of behavior. Each comment, each glance, each orchestrated slight was adding to a pattern that he understood all too well. As he finished his notes and prepared for bed, he couldn't help but think about how many similar situations he'd investigated over the years. The only difference was that this time, he wasn't just documenting someone else's story. He was living it. The autumn leaves were just beginning to fall when things took a darker turn in Riverside Heights. The FBI agent woke one morning to find 3 separate notices from the Homeowners Association stuffed in his mailbox, each one citing increasingly ridiculous violations. One complained about his grass being a 1/4 inch too tall, another about the shade of his curtains not matching approved color schemes, and the third about suspicious late-night activities, which was actually just him arriving home from teaching evening classes at Quantico. He carefully added these notices to his growing file of documentation, noting how the handwriting on the complaints matched his across-the-street neighbor's signatures from the block party register. Their campaign had grown more aggressive over the past few weeks, but they were smart enough to use official channels to mask their true intentions. That same afternoon, while he was tending to his garden, a police cruiser rolled slowly past his house for the third time that week. He recognized the young officer behind the wheel, looking uncomfortable as he responded to yet another call about suspicious activity. The agent waved politely, and the officer gave a slight nod before driving away, clearly embarrassed about being forced to perform these unnecessary patrols. "I told you we needed increased security," the wife from across the street announced loudly to another neighbor standing deliberately in her front yard. "You just can't be too careful these days. Did you know someone was in their backyard at midnight last week? Probably casing houses." She cast a meaningful glance toward the agent's home. The neighbor she was speaking to, an elderly woman who had lived in the community for decades, frowned slightly. "Dear, I think you might be mistaken. I was up late that night with my arthritis, and I saw him coming home from work. He teaches at the academy, you know." But the wife waved off this rational explanation. "That's what he claims. But have you seen any proof? Anyone can buy a briefcase and dress up in a suit." Later that evening, the agent's doorbell rang. He opened it to find Mrs. Chen, a quiet resident from 2 houses down, standing nervously on his porch. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder. "But I wanted you to know. They're trying to get signatures for a petition, something about community standards and property values. My husband and I refused to sign." He thanked her for the information, noting how her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. It wasn't just fear of the couple that made her nervous, it was the weight of finally taking a stand. "Would you be willing to make a statement about this if necessary?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded firmly. The next morning, he found his newspaper in the bushes, soaked through despite the clear weather. As he retrieved it, he noticed his security cameras had been tilted slightly upward overnight, not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough to affect their coverage. He adjusted them back, making a note of the timestamps when the tampering had occurred. The campaign continued to escalate. Anonymous notes appeared in neighbors' mailboxes warning about changing neighborhood demographics. The couple organized impromptu HOA meetings at times when they knew he would be teaching. His mail started arriving mysteriously late, often wrinkled or slightly torn. But what the couple didn't realize was that their actions were creating unexpected ripples through the community. The officer who had been responding to their calls finally filed a report about harassment of police services. The retired judge 3 doors down, disturbed by the pattern he was witnessing, reached out to offer his support. Even the teenage kids who did lawn work in the neighborhood started refusing jobs at the couple's house, having overheard one too many racist comments. During this time, the agent maintained his routine with unwavering calm. He left for work each morning with a cheerful wave to any watching neighbors. He kept his lawn immaculate, his house well maintained, and his manner unfailingly professional. Each incident, each comment, each small act of harassment was carefully documented, photographed, and filed away. His security system now included cameras with night vision and audio capabilities, all properly permitted and legally installed. Every interaction was recorded, every threatening note preserved in evidence bags, every witness statement carefully logged. He'd learned long ago that the best weapon against hatred was methodical documentation. One evening, as he reviewed the day's footage, he noticed something interesting. The couple had begun receiving regular visits from people who didn't live in the neighborhood. These visitors always came in expensive cars with out-of-state plates, and the meetings always happened in their garage with the door carefully closed. To most people, this might have seemed unremarkable, but to a veteran FBI agent, it set off familiar warning bells. He picked up his phone and made a call to a trusted colleague. "Remember that pattern we've been tracking in the eastern districts?" he said quietly. "I think I might have found another piece of the puzzle." As he spoke, he watched through his window as another luxury car pulled into the couple's driveway, its plates matching a sequence he'd been investigating for months. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture much larger and more complex than simple neighborhood harassment. But for now, he continued his patient documentation, knowing that sometimes the best way to expose darkness was to let it grow bold enough to step into the light on its own. The FBI conference room buzzed with quiet intensity as agents gathered around the large screen displaying surveillance photos. The images showed the couple's garage meetings, time-stamped over several weeks, with faces of visitors carefully highlighted and cross-referenced. What had started as a simple neighborhood harassment case had unexpectedly connected to a larger investigation that spanned 3 states. "These meetings match the pattern we've been seeing," explained a senior analyst, pointing to a timeline. "Same types of vehicles, same meeting durations, same security precautions. They're part of something bigger." She clicked through more photos showing similar gatherings at other upscale neighborhoods across Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. The agent who lived across from the couple sat quietly at the back of the room, having formally recused himself from direct involvement in the case. Still, he couldn't help but notice how his personal documentation had helped fill crucial gaps in the larger investigation. His detailed notes about the couple's behavioral patterns, their escalating actions, and their careful targeting of specific neighbors had revealed a methodology that matched cases in other communities. "We've identified at least 7 other neighborhoods where this group operates," continued the analyst. "They move in, establish themselves as respectable community members, then gradually begin pushing out residents they consider undesirable." She pulled up property records showing how home values had been artificially manipulated in these areas through coordinated harassment campaigns. After the briefing, the agent's supervisor pulled him aside. "You know you'll have to maintain your cover a bit longer," she said quietly. "We need to understand the full scope of their operation." The agent nodded, knowing that his role would now be even more crucial, not as an investigator, but as a catalyst that might bring the group's true nature into the open. Back in his neighborhood that evening, he noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. More unmarked cars parking briefly on side streets. Occasional glints of light from camera lenses in parked vehicles. The careful dance of surveillance had begun, though only he recognized the signs. The couple across the street seemed energized lately, their harassment becoming more overt as they mistook his continued calm for weakness. They'd begun organizing weekly neighborhood safety meetings that somehow always excluded certain residents. Their garage had become a hub of activity, with expensive cars coming and going at all hours. What they didn't realize was that each visitor was now being carefully photographed, their license plates logged, their movements tracked across state lines. The agent's security cameras, which they'd tried so hard to disable, were providing valuable intelligence about the group's membership and hierarchy. One morning, he overheard the wife on her phone in her front yard, speaking just loudly enough to be heard. "Yes, everything's proceeding according to plan. This neighborhood will be back to the right kind of community soon enough. We've done it before, we'll do it again." The agent added this conversation to his daily report, noting how it matched similar language used in other documented cases. The group's pattern was becoming clearer. They weren't just random acts of prejudice, but rather a carefully orchestrated campaign to reshape communities according to their twisted vision. His neighbor 2 doors down, the retired judge, stopped by one evening under the pretense of borrowing a garden tool. "I've been watching what's happening," the judge said quietly. "I've seen cases like this before from the bench. It starts small, but it's never really small, is it?" The agent smiled slightly, appreciating how years of legal experience had given the judge a similar eye for patterns. In the FBI office, photos of the couple now held prominent places on the investigation board, connected by red strings to similar cases across the region. Financial records were being carefully traced, showing suspicious patterns of property purchases and sales. Phone records revealed a network of connections that stretched far beyond their quiet suburban street. The agent's security footage had captured something particularly interesting. During the garage meetings, visitors would often carry in folders with a distinctive blue stripe across the top. These matched documents that had been discovered in other investigations, containing detailed plans for manipulating property values and orchestrating harassment campaigns. As fall turned to winter, the investigation continued to build. Each piece of evidence, each connection revealed, painted a picture of an organization that had been operating in plain sight, using the respectability of suburban life as a cover for their activities. The couple remained oblivious to the net slowly closing around them. They continued their campaign of harassment, growing bolder with each unanswered provocation. The wife had even begun talking openly about their success stories in other neighborhoods, not realizing she was providing valuable confirmation of the group's activities in other jurisdictions. Late one night, as the agent reviewed the day's surveillance footage, he noticed something new. The couple was receiving packages late at night, delivered not by regular courier services, but by the same cars that attended their garage meetings. Each package was handled with extreme care, suggesting contents more significant than ordinary mail. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a familiar number. "We might need to accelerate the timeline," he said quietly. "They're moving something through the network, and they're being careful about it." On his screen, another luxury car pulled up to the couple's house, its trunk opening to reveal more packages with that distinctive blue stripe. The pieces were all there now: the evidence, the connections, the pattern of organized activity. Soon, very soon, the couple would discover that their campaign of harassment had led them to make their biggest mistake yet. They had unknowingly invited intense federal scrutiny into their organization, and the consequences would reach far beyond their quiet suburban street. The winter storm had blanketed Riverside Heights in thick snow, creating an eerie silence that seemed to amplify every sound. The FBI agent was reviewing case files in his home office when he heard it, the distinct crack of spray paint cans being shaken, followed by muffled laughter from his front yard. His security cameras showed the couple from across the street, bundled in expensive winter coats, approaching his garage door in the darkness. The wife held a flashlight while her husband clutched something in his gloved hands. Their breath formed clouds in the cold air as they whispered to each other, clearly believing the storm provided perfect cover for their actions. The agent watched through his cameras as they began their vandalism, the husband's arm moving in quick strokes across the garage door. He had expected something like this. People who start with subtle harassment often escalate to property damage when their initial tactics fail to get the desired response. He calmly picked up his phone and pressed record, documenting everything through his security system. Instead of calling for backup immediately, he decided to handle the initial confrontation himself. He needed to give them enough rope to fully incriminate themselves. Pulling on a heavy coat, he silently opened his front door and stepped onto his porch, making sure to stay within range of his security cameras. "Can I help you with something?" His voice cut through the winter silence, causing both of them to freeze mid-action. The husband's hand was still raised, spray paint glinting in the security lights that had just activated. The wife's flashlight beam jerked wildly before settling on the agent's face. "We caught you," the wife shouted, her voice shrill with false bravado. "We saw you sneaking around last night. We're documenting suspicious activity." The obvious lie hung in the air, contradicted by the spray paint can in her husband's hand and the half-finished hateful message on the garage door. The agent stepped forward calmly, phone still recording. "Interesting way to document things," he said, gesturing to the spray paint. "I'm sure the police will find your documentation methods fascinating." He kept his voice level, professional, the same tone he'd used in countless confrontations throughout his career. The husband's face contorted with anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he snarled, taking a step forward. "We have friends in the police department. Nobody's going to believe you over us. We've done this before, and we'll do it again. This is our neighborhood." "Really?" the agent asked quietly. "Tell me more about how you've done this before." He was giving them the opportunity to incriminate themselves further, and in their anger, they took the bait. The wife stepped forward, jabbing her finger toward him. "We've cleaned up 3 neighborhoods before this one. We know how to handle people like you. Our organization has connections you couldn't imagine. By the time we're done, you'll wish you'd never moved here." The agent noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Curtains twitching in nearby houses, phones recording from windows. The couple's raised voices had drawn an audience. Perfect. More witnesses to their true nature. And what organization would that be? He asked calmly, watching the husband's face turn redder with each word. "The same one that holds meetings in your garage every Tuesday. The one with the blue-striped folders and the out-of-state license plates." The couple's expressions shifted from anger to confusion, then to the first flickers of fear. How could he know about the folders? The husband's grip on the spray paint loosened slightly, his bravado wavering. "You're being recorded right now," the agent continued, his voice still professionally calm. "Not just by my phone, but by multiple security cameras, including the one you failed to disable last week. Would you like to explain the purpose of your organization for the record?" The wife grabbed her husband's arm. "Don't say another word," she hissed. "He's bluffing. He can't prove anything." We'll just say we caught him vandalizing his own property to frame us. Who do you think they'll believe?" The agent smiled slightly. "Why don't we ask your friends in law enforcement? The ones you claim to have connections with. I'm particularly interested in hearing their thoughts on how you've done this before in other neighborhoods." The husband's face had drained of color as realization slowly dawned. They'd finally chosen the wrong target, and their own arrogance had led them to admit far too much. The wife was tugging on her husband's arm now, trying to pull him away, but he seemed frozen in place. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice trembling slightly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Our lawyers will." "Will what?" The agent interrupted softly. "Explain the spray paint, the harassment campaign, the mysterious meetings, the pattern of behavior across multiple states." He took out his badge, letting it catch the security lights. "I think your lawyers will be quite busy enough dealing with federal charges." The couple stumbled backward, the spray paint clattering to the ground. As they retreated across the street, the agent could hear them frantically whispering to each other. He calmly took photos of the half-finished vandalism, the dropped spray paint can, and their retreating figures. Inside his house, he sent the video to his colleagues at the bureau. Within hours, it would be added to the mountain of evidence they'd collected. The couple's impulsive act of vandalism had given them exactly what they needed: direct proof of their involvement in a pattern of organized harassment. As the storm continued to blanket the neighborhood in snow, more lights came on in nearby houses. The agent could see his neighbors watching, finally witnessing the true nature of the couple who had terrorized their community. Tomorrow would bring formal charges and arrests, but for now, he simply stood on his porch, watching as the couple's perfect facade crumbled in the winter night. Dawn broke over Riverside Heights with red and gold streaks painting the snow-covered lawns. The quiet morning peace was shattered by the synchronized arrival of multiple FBI vehicles, their lights flashing silently as they surrounded the couple's house. Neighbors emerged onto their porches, wrapped in robes and clutching coffee mugs, watching the scene unfold like a movie in their own backyard. The FBI agent stood in his driveway, now wearing his official jacket with the bold yellow letters clearly visible. He watched as his colleagues, led by the senior agent in charge, approached the couple's front door with practiced efficiency. The wife opened the door in her designer pajamas, her face shifting from annoyance to shock as she read the search warrant being presented to her. "What is the meaning of this?" her husband demanded, appearing behind her in an expensive bathrobe. "Do you know who we are? We have rights." His voice carried across the street, but it had lost the commanding tone he usually used to intimidate others. Now it held a note of barely controlled panic. The senior agent remained professionally calm. "Sir, we have a federal warrant to search these premises in connection with an ongoing investigation into organized harassment, civil rights violations, and interstate racketeering." She gestured to her team, who began entering the house with evidence collection kits. The couple stood on their front steps, watching helplessly as FBI agents began methodically searching their home. Their eyes darted around the neighborhood, seeking allies, but found only stony faces and recording phones. The curtain of respectability they'd hidden behind for so long was being pulled away in front of the entire community. Through his security cameras, the agent could see the couple's faces as they spotted him across the street. Their expressions transformed from confusion to dawning horror as they finally recognized him, not as the neighbor they'd tried to intimidate, but as the federal agent who'd been documenting their every move. "You?" the wife whispered, loud enough to carry across the street. All this time. Her designer slippers crunched in the snow as she took an unconscious step backward, bumping into her husband who stood frozen, his face ashen. The FBI agent simply nodded, then turned to assist his colleagues who were now carrying boxes of evidence from the house. Each box contained carefully organized files, the same blue-striped folders that had been observed during their secret meetings. Financial records, property documents, and detailed plans for what they called community improvement projects in various neighborhoods across 3 states. Neighbors who had been silently watching began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the unfolding drama. The retired judge stood on his porch, nodding in grim satisfaction. Mrs. Chen and her husband held hands as they watched from their driveway, relief evident on their faces. The young police officer who had been forced to respond to false complaints drove by slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In the garage, the agent called out to his colleagues, behind the pegboard on the north wall. The couple's faces fell further as agents quickly located and removed a hidden safe containing documents that would tie them to similar operations in other states. The wife's composure finally cracked. "We were protecting our community," she shouted, her voice shrill with desperation. "Everything we did was for the good of the neighborhood." Her words echoed across the silent street, met only by the sound of evidence being catalogued and photographed. "The community didn't need your kind of protection," the retired judge called out from his porch, his voice carrying the weight of years on the bench. Other neighbors murmured in agreement, years of pent-up disapproval finally finding voice. As agents continued their methodical search, more evidence of the couple's true activities came to light. Hidden cameras they had used to spy on neighbors, lists of residents they had successfully driven out of other communities, detailed correspondence with similar groups across the country, revealing a network of organized harassment masked by a veneer of suburban respectability. The husband attempted one last display of authority. "Our lawyers will hear about this. We have friends in high places," but his words sounded hollow now, stripped of the power they once held over the neighborhood. One of the FBI agents emerged from the house carrying a laptop and several external hard drives, and the husband's face went even paler. The agent watched as his colleagues began wrapping up the search. He could see the couple's world crumbling around them as each piece of evidence was catalogued and sealed. Their carefully constructed facade of respectability, maintained through fear and intimidation, was being dismantled box by box, file by file. Throughout the morning, more neighbors gathered to watch, maintaining a respectful distance but unwilling to miss this moment of justice. Children peeked out from behind their parents, sensing the significance of what was happening. The community that the couple had tried so hard to control was witnessing their downfall. As the winter sun climbed higher, the FBI vehicles began to depart one by one, their evidence cargo secured. The couple remained on their front steps, their expensive robes now wrinkled, their expressions stunned. They watched as their years of calculated harassment and manipulation were reduced to evidence box numbers and catalog entries. The agent took one last look at the scene before getting into his car. The couple's garage door stood open, revealing the empty space where their secret meetings had taken place. The pegboard wall now showed a conspicuous rectangle where the hidden safe had been concealed. Their perfect suburban fortress had been exposed for what it truly was, a headquarters for organized hatred, now stripped bare in the winter morning light. Spring had returned to Riverside Heights, bringing with it more than just blooming flowers and warmer days. The federal courthouse downtown buzzed with activity as reporters gathered to cover what had become one of the most significant civil rights cases in recent memory. The couple's trial had revealed a network of organized harassment spanning multiple states, leading to dozens of additional arrests and investigations. Inside the courthouse, the FBI agents sat quietly in the gallery, watching as the couple faced justice for their actions. Gone were their designer clothes and air of superiority, replaced by business attire that seemed to hang uncomfortably on their shoulders. As the evidence was presented, thousands of pages of documents, hours of video footage, testimony from countless victims, their faces grew increasingly pale. The defendants didn't just target individuals, the prosecutor explained to the jury. They attempted to reshape entire communities through systematic harassment and intimidation. They used their wealth and social status as weapons, hiding their hatred behind respectability and false concerns about property values. The retired judge from the neighborhood had come to watch the proceedings, sitting beside Mrs. Chen and her husband. They represented just a few of the many neighbors who had come forward to testify about the pattern of harassment they had witnessed. Their courage in speaking out had inspired others from different communities to share similar stories. During breaks in the trial, the agent would sometimes observe small groups huddled in the courthouse hallways, former residents of other neighborhoods where the couple had operated, sharing their experiences of being driven from their homes. Some cried, others expressed anger, but most simply showed relief that someone had finally exposed the truth. The evidence was overwhelming. The blue-striped folders had contained detailed plans for what they called community purification, systematic strategies for making life unbearable for residents they deemed undesirable. The hidden cameras had recorded their own boasting about previous successful campaigns. Their computers held spreadsheets tracking their progress in different neighborhoods, treating people's lives like numbers to be eliminated. When the guilty verdict was announced, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the courtroom. The couple's lawyers immediately began talking about appeals, but their voices were drowned out by the judge's stern pronouncement of their sentences. Years in federal prison, massive fines, and orders to pay restitution to their victims. Back in Riverside Heights, the community had undergone its own transformation. The agent noticed the changes during his evening walks. Neighbors who had once hurried past each other now stopped to chat. Children played freely between houses, no longer confined by invisible boundaries of fear. The HOA meetings, once dominated by the couple's allies, had become open forums for genuine community improvement. Mrs. Chen had been elected as the new HOA president, her quiet strength earning the trust of her neighbors. Under her leadership, the community started hosting monthly cultural exchange dinners, where residents shared food and stories from their diverse backgrounds. The retired judge offered free legal advice clinics in the community center, helping residents understand their rights. One sunny afternoon, while tending to his garden, the agent received a visit from his supervisor. "Your case has opened up similar investigations in 12 other states," she reported, watching a group of children ride their bikes freely past houses where they once feared to go. "We're finding the same pattern everywhere. Organized groups using real estate and social pressure as weapons. Your documentation set the precedent for how we handle these cases now." The story had attracted national attention, sparking discussions about hidden discrimination in seemingly progressive communities. News crews occasionally drove through the neighborhood, hoping to capture footage of the now famous street where the case began. But what they found instead was a community actively working to heal and improve. At the FBI Academy in Quantico, the agent incorporated the case into his teaching curriculum. "Look beyond the obvious," he would tell his students, sharing redacted footage from his security cameras. "Hatred doesn't always march down the street carrying torches. Sometimes it hides behind manicured lawns and social committees. Your job is to see through the facade." New residents began moving into the neighborhood, drawn by its reputation for genuine inclusivity. The agent watched from his porch as moving trucks brought families of all backgrounds to streets once patrolled by prejudice. Each new face represented a small victory, another crack in the walls of discrimination the couple had tried to build. The house across the street, seized as part of the federal case, was converted into a community center. Where secret meetings once plotted exclusion, children now gathered for tutoring programs. The garage that had housed their operation became a meeting space for local civil rights organizations. The transformation felt like poetry. Hatred's fortress turned into a beacon of hope. As summer approached, the neighborhood organized its first inclusive block party. Tables lined the streets, loaded with dishes from dozens of cultural traditions. Music in different languages filled the air. The agent stood back, watching elderly residents teaching young children games from their childhoods, teenagers helping their neighbors set up chairs, families sharing recipes and stories. "You know," the retired judge said, joining him with a plate of food, "some people might have just moved away. Sought an easier life somewhere else. But you stayed and showed us how to stand up for what's right." The agent smiled, watching a group of kids draw chalk art on the same driveway where the couple had once held their exclusive gatherings. The case had become required reading in law schools, not just for its legal significance, but for what it revealed about modern discrimination. Students studied how wealth and social status could be used as tools of oppression, and how one person's quiet resistance could expose an entire network of organized hatred. But the agent knew the real lesson wasn't in the legal books or case files. It was in the sounds of children playing without fear, in the sight of neighbors helping neighbors, in the slow but steady work of building a truly inclusive community. The couple had tried to create their version of a perfect neighborhood, never realizing that perfection lay in the very diversity they fought against. As night fell over Riverside Heights, porch lights winked on one by one, each a small beacon of welcome. The agent sat on his front steps, watching the peaceful scene. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new battles for justice. But for now, he could rest in the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come not from dramatic confrontations, but from the quiet courage to stand firm in the face of hatred, documenting truth until justice prevails.